The Lost Colony of Roanoke, Part 1, Dreams Across the Ocean. Imagine the salty wind of the Atlantic brushing against your face. It's the summer of 1584, and a small English ship creaks and groans as it cuts through the waves toward an unknown world. The sailors stand at the bow, eyes fixed on the horizon, a vast stretch of wilderness that no Englishman has ever claimed. This is the dawn of England's first great experiment in the New World, Roanoke. The dream began in the mind of one man, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was not a simple explorer. He was a courtier, a poet, a soldier, and one of Queen Elizabeth I's favorite adventurers. England, at that time, was hungry for glory. Spain ruled the seas with gold and silver pouring in from its colonies. Portugal had its empire in Africa and Asia. France was exploring Canada. But England was late to the race. And Raleigh promised to change that. He received a royal patent from Elizabeth herself, permission to claim new lands in the name of the crown, as long as those lands were not already possessed by a Christian monarch. In other words, the door to the Americas was open wide. All he had to do was step through. So, in 1584, Raleigh sent out an expedition led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow to scout the North American coast. Their mission: find a suitable place for settlement. After weeks at sea, they finally reached a chain of barrier islands off what is now North Carolina. The air was thick with pine and cedar. The soil was rich, the climate mild, and the coastline alive with fish and game. To the English, it seemed like paradise. The explorers landed on Roanoke Island, nestled between the mainland and the Outer Banks. There, they met the local Algonquian-speaking tribes, notably the Secotnan and Croatan peoples. Relations, at first, were warm. Gifts were exchanged. The English marveled at the beauty of the land, the craftsmanship of the native canoes, the abundance of corn, melons, and tobacco. They even brought two native men, Manteo and Wanchese, back to England, living proof of this new world to show the Queen. When Amadas and Barlow returned home, they painted Roanoke as an earthly Eden. Their report spoke of gentle natives, fertile soil, and endless opportunity. The Queen herself was impressed. She named the region Virginia, in honor of her own title, the Virgin Queen. And Raleigh, her loyal servant, was determined to make it England's first permanent colony. The following year, Raleigh organized a far larger expedition. This one was led by his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, and the talented soldier-scientist Ralph Lane. On April 9, 1585, 7 ships carrying around 600 men sailed for the Americas. Among them were skilled artisans, soldiers, and even a few scientists eager to map the new land and record its wonders. Also on board were the 2 Algonquian men from the previous voyage, Manteo and Wanchese, now acting as guides and translators. But from the very start, the journey was cursed by bad luck. A storm near the Azores scattered the fleet. One ship caught fire, destroying much of its food supply. By the time they reached the Carolina coast, they were hungry and irritable. Yet when they finally dropped anchor near Roanoke, hope was reborn. They built a small fort, Fort Raleigh, and claimed the island for England. Governor Ralph Lane took command. His orders were clear: establish relations with the native tribes, explore the mainland, and search for gold, silver, or a route to the Pacific. The English still dreamed that somewhere beyond those forests lay the fabled riches of Asia. At first, the natives welcomed them. Chief Wingina of the Secotnan tribe allowed the English to stay. They shared food, showed them how to plant local crops, and traded deer hides and fish for metal goods. But as months passed, tensions grew. The English demanded more food than the locals could spare, and Lane's soldiers sometimes used force when diplomacy failed. Mutual suspicion deepened. Manteo, loyal to the English, warned Lane that the tribes were beginning to lose patience. Meanwhile, Lane's men were struggling. The sandy soil was poor for English crops. Mosquitoes carried disease. Fresh water was scarce. And worst of all, the promised supply ship from England was delayed. By winter, food was running dangerously low. Then came disaster. After a misunderstanding with the Second, Lane ordered an attack on their village. Chief Wingina was killed, and the fragile peace collapsed. The English had turned potential allies into enemies. Roanoke was now isolated and surrounded by hostility. In June 1586, salvation appeared on the horizon. The famous privateer Sir Francis Drake, returning from raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, stopped by Roanoke to check on the settlers. He found them starving and demoralized. Lane begged to be taken home, and Drake agreed. The first English colony in America was abandoned. When Grenville later arrived with supplies and reinforcements, he found the fort empty. Unwilling to let England's claim vanish entirely, he left 15 soldiers behind to hold Roanoke for the crown, a token garrison in a hostile land. None of them were ever seen again. By now, Raleigh's grand colonial dreams were beginning to look cursed. But he refused to give up. He planned a new expedition, this time, not just soldiers and adventurers, but families. Men, women, and children who would build a true English community. The mission would be led by John White, an artist and cartographer who had traveled on the first voyage. White was thoughtful, idealistic, and genuinely believed that cooperation with the natives could work, if only the English behaved differently this time. In May 1587, 3 ships carrying around 115 settlers set sail from Portsmouth. On board were artisans, carpenters, farmers, and even pregnant women. Among them was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband Ananias. They were the heart of this new colony, a chance to build not just a fort, but a society. But from the moment they arrived, things went wrong again. The plan was to settle in Chesapeake Bay, where the land was said to be richer and the harbors deeper. Yet the fleet's pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to go further north. He claimed it was too dangerous and insisted they disembark at Roanoke, the same doomed site as before. White protested, but it was too late. The settlers stepped ashore amid the ruins of Lane's old fort. The charred timbers of Fort Raleigh still stood, half buried in sand. Of the 15 men Grenville had left behind, there was no trace. Only a single human skeleton was found nearby. The new colonists felt the weight of ghosts in that lonely place. Still, they tried to rebuild. They repaired the palisade, planted crops, and re-established contact with friendly natives, notably Manteo and his Croatan people, who still supported the English. Manteo's friendship would prove vital, as the Secondon and other neighboring tribes remained bitter over past violence. Then, in August 1587, something remarkable happened. A child was born. Virginia Dare, daughter of Eleanor and Ananias Dare, became the first English child born in the New World. Her birth was celebrated as a symbol of hope, proof that England had finally planted its seed in America. Bells rang aboard the ships, toasts were made to her health. John White, now a grandfather, believed destiny was smiling on them again. But the colony's supplies were dangerously low. White knew they couldn't survive another winter without help. The settlers urged him to sail back to England for more provisions, and promised they would endure until his return. Reluctantly, White agreed. He kissed his daughter and newborn granddaughter goodbye, boarded a ship, and set sail across the Atlantic. It was the last time he would ever see them. When John White reached England, he expected to gather supplies and return within months. But the world had changed. In 1588, Spain launched its mighty armada against England, and every available ship was seized for war. Raleigh, Drake, and others were called to defend the homeland. White pleaded for a single vessel to return to Roanoke, but it was impossible. England's survival came first. 2 long years passed. By the time White finally secured passage back to the colony, the Atlantic seemed endless. His ship, battered by storms and chased by pirates, crept slowly westward. What awaited him on the other side, no one could guess. And when he finally arrived, he found nothing but silence. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, Part 2, The Vanishing of the Colony. It was late August of 1590 when John White finally stood again on the sandy shores of Roanoke Island. The waves rolled gently under a cloudless sky, but the world before him was eerily still. The place where the English settlement once stood, where his daughter, his son-in-law, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare had lived, now looked abandoned. There were no shouts of welcome, no smoke from chimneys, no familiar faces waiting by the palisade. White's heart pounded as he climbed out of the longboat and waded ashore. 3 years had passed since he'd left. 3 years of storms, wars, and waiting. He had replayed this reunion in his mind 1,000 times. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found. The fort still stood, silent, weathered, overgrown with vines. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle or attack. The houses had been dismantled carefully, as if by the colonists themselves. The chests and furniture were gone, but the palisade was intact. White's men explored cautiously, calling out the names of friends, searching for any trace of life. Then one of them shouted, there was something carved into a tree. A single word, Croton. Another carving, on a nearby post, read simply, CRO. White's pulse quickened. Before he'd left 3 years earlier, he had made a promise with the settlers: if they ever had to relocate, they should carve the name of their new destination somewhere visible. And if they were in danger, they were to add a cross above the letters. There was no cross. To White, that meant hope. The colonists had moved, likely south, to Croton Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, home of their ally Manteo and his friendly tribe. It was a rational move. The Croatans had food, shelter, and kinship with the English. Perhaps his daughter and granddaughter were alive there, waiting for rescue. White wanted to set sail immediately. But the captain of his ship refused. Storms were gathering, the anchor cables were fraying, and the crew was terrified of losing their vessel on the dangerous shoals of the Outer Banks. Reluctantly, White was forced to turn back toward England once again, his heart heavy, his hope fading. He never saw the New World again. In the centuries that followed, the mystery of Roanoke became one of America's great unsolved stories. What happened to the 115 men, women, and children who vanished from that island? Historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have proposed countless theories. Some suggest the colonists did exactly what White believed: they joined Manteo's Croton people, blending into the native community and surviving through intermarriage and cultural adaptation. Others think they tried to sail north toward the Chesapeake, where they originally intended to settle, but were lost at sea. Some believe they were killed by hostile tribes. And still others think disease, starvation, or even internal conflict may have doomed them. But the truth remains hidden, buried under centuries of sand and silence. One thing, however, is clear: the colonists of Roanoke were not the victims of a simple disaster. They were the pioneers of a dangerous dream, the dream of England's empire in the New World. And their disappearance sent shockwaves across both sides of the Atlantic. Back in England, Sir Walter Raleigh's grand colonial ambitions were crumbling. The loss of Roanoke was not just a tragedy, it was an embarrassment. Raleigh had invested heavily in the venture: ships, men, supplies, and royal reputation. When news of the disappearance spread, his critics pounced. They accused him of wasting money, of arrogance, even of witchcraft. The Queen grew cold toward him. Within a few years, Raleigh fell out of favor, imprisoned more than once in the Tower of London. Yet the dream he began did not die. Other Englishmen picked up the torch, among them, a group known as the Virginia Company, who would later found Jamestown in 1607. Their colony, too, would face starvation, disease, and conflict, but it would endure. In many ways, Jamestown's success was built on the bones of Roanoke's failure. Raleigh himself would meet a tragic end, executed in 1618 after a failed expedition to South America. But by then, the seeds he planted had already taken root. The English Empire had begun. Still, the ghost of Roanoke refused to fade. Stories persisted among the native tribes of the Carolina coast. Some spoke of pale-skinned people living far inland, who dressed like the English and spoke strangely accented tongues. Others claimed to have seen children with light eyes and hair among the native villages. In the early 1600s, when Jamestown settlers began exploring the region, they, too, heard rumors of white Indians, who might be descendants of the lost colonists. One explorer, Captain John Smith, the same who famously met Pocahontas, was told by the Powhatan chief that his warriors had killed a group of English settlers who had been living among another tribe. According to this account, the Powhatans had attacked out of fear that the strangers were spies or enemies. Smith's records are vague, and historians still debate whether the story referred to the Roanoke colonists or to some later English sailors. Another clue emerged decades later when English colonists encountered tribes whose members could read a few English words, recite fragments of Christian prayers, or identify European tools. Coincidence? Or evidence of cultural blending? Archaeologists have searched for answers for over 4 centuries. Excavations at Hatteras Island, the historical Croton, have uncovered European artifacts, copper rings, sword hilts, glass beads, and pieces of Elizabethan pottery. But such items were often traded widely between tribes, so their presence alone cannot prove that the colonists lived there. Inland, near the Albemarle Sound, other sites have yielded similar findings. Perhaps the colonists split into groups, some joining the Croton, others seeking refuge further west. The wilderness could easily swallow them whole. And yet, the absence of graves, journals, or letters haunts the story. It's as though the colony simply evaporated. In the 1930s, a Georgia man claimed to have found something extraordinary near the Chowan River, a large stone carved with a message from Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The inscription, supposedly written in 1591, described the deaths of many colonists from war and sickness and claimed that only 7 survived. The message ended with the words, Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence unto heaven 1591. Over the next few years, more Dare stones appeared, 48 in total, scattered across the Carolinas and Georgia. If true, they could reveal the colonists' tragic final journey southward. But scholars soon grew skeptical. Many of the stones were forgeries, planted by hoaxers seeking fame. Only the first stone, the so-called Chowan stone, remains under debate. Some experts think it could be genuine, others dismiss it entirely. Still, it captures the enduring power of the legend. Roanoke is not just a historical puzzle, it's an American myth. It represents both the promise and the peril of the colonial dream. The settlers crossed an ocean chasing a vision of freedom, faith, and fortune, but found themselves trapped between worlds, too far from England to return, too alien to be accepted by the native peoples, too early to survive the wilderness alone. Their story became a reflection of the American identity itself, the courage to begin again, the tragedy of failure, and the mystery that lingers just beyond the horizon. Poets, playwrights, and novelists have retold the tale countless times. Some imagine that the colonists survived and built hidden communities. Others weave supernatural explanations, curses, spirits, or vanished civilizations. Modern television and movies still revisit the legend, blending fact and fiction. Yet beneath every retelling lies the same haunting question, what really happened? When you walk the sandy trails of Roanoke Island today, you can still feel the weight of silence. The reconstructed Fort Raleigh stands among tall pines, overlooking the same calm waters where English ships once anchored. Birdsong fills the air. The ocean breeze whispers through the grass. It's easy to imagine the laughter of settlers, the cries of children, the hammering of carpenters, echoes of a colony that vanished without a trace. Historians continue to search. Modern archaeology uses satellites, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis. Each new discovery, a fragment of pottery, a rusted buckle, a European-style nail, brings us one step closer to understanding. But the full truth remains out of reach. John White died in England, never knowing the fate of his family. His final writings end not with certainty, but with longing, a grandfather forever haunted by the lost faces of his daughter and her child. Yet perhaps that is the real legacy of Roanoke, not the mystery of their disappearance, but the endurance of their hope. Because from that failure came lessons that shaped the colonies to come, lessons about adaptation, cooperation, and survival. Roanoke was the first chapter in the story of America, and like all beginnings, it was fragile, tragic, and unforgettable. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, Part 3, Legacy and Lessons. Centuries have passed since the last footprints of the Roanoke colonists faded from the sand. Yet their story still whispers across the Carolina coast. It lingers in the pine forests, in the shifting dunes, and in the hearts of everyone who wonders what it means to begin again in an unknown world. Because Roanoke was not simply a failure, it was the first spark of a nation's story. When the English lost contact with the colony in 1590, many believed the dream of America had died with it. For a time, Queen Elizabeth turned her eyes elsewhere. The seas were dangerous, Spain was still powerful, and the wounds of defeat ran deep. But in the shadows of failure, something remarkable happened. The idea of America, of a land where English people could build a new life, refused to vanish. The reports brought home by explorers like Amatus, Barlow, and John White had captured the imagination of a restless people. England was crowded, hungry, and restless. The poor were growing poorer, the rich hungrier for trade and power. To many, the New World was not a fantasy, it was a chance for survival. So when Sir Walter Raleigh's fortune collapsed, others took up his vision. The Virginia Company of London, formed in 1606, revived the colonial project under new leadership. Among its investors were merchants, nobles, and dreamers who still believed an English empire could flourish across the Atlantic. And so, 20 years after Roanoke's disappearance, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, set sail for America. Their destination lay just a few hundred miles north of the lost colony. Their settlement would be called Jamestown. Jamestown faced its own nightmares, famine, disease, attacks from nearby tribes. At one point, only 60 of the original colonists survived. Yet despite everything, they endured, because, unlike Roanoke, they had learned. They brought more supplies, stronger leadership, and clear backing from the English crown. Most importantly, they forged uneasy but lasting relations with the Powhatan Confederacy, whose aid kept the colony alive. Every successful expedition after 1607, from the Pilgrims at Plymouth to the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, carried Roanoke's ghost as a warning. Never again would England send settlers unprepared, unsupported, or forgotten. The lesson of Roanoke was simple: survival in the New World required partnership, adaptation, and patience. In that sense, the lost colony was not lost at all. It became the teacher of an empire. There's another legacy, quieter, more mysterious. When Europeans and native peoples first met on Roanoke Island, neither could have imagined how deeply their worlds would entwine. The English brought steel, guns, and Christianity. The Algonquian peoples brought corn, fish, medicine, and the knowledge of the land. For a brief moment, they stood face to face, 2 civilizations, curious and cautious. If the Roanoke settlers truly merged with the Croton or Secondon peoples, as some evidence suggests, then their descendants would have been among the first children of a new, mixed world, part English, part Native American. That possibility changes everything. It means Roanoke was not a dead end, but a beginning. It means that the first English colony didn't vanish, it transformed. It became something the world wasn't ready to see, an early example of cultural fusion, a human bridge between 2 continents. In the centuries that followed, countless people of native heritage in the Carolinas and Virginia would claim descent from those settlers, from Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. Her name would become legend, a symbol of innocence, hope, and mystery. Stories tell of her growing up among the tribes, fair-haired and brave, leading a life between worlds. Some even claim she was transformed by native spirits into a white doe, forever wandering the woods, the ghost of a forgotten colony. Myth or not, the story of Virginia Dare endured because it carried truth in its heart, that America was born not from one people, but from many. By the 1800s, as the United States expanded westward, the tale of Roanoke became something larger than history, it became myth. Writers, painters, and politicians used the lost colony to define what it meant to be American. They saw in its mystery both tragedy and destiny. To some, it was a warning, of arrogance, of ignorance, of the price paid for empire. To others, it was a romantic origin story, the first spark of courage in a wilderness that would one day become a nation. In 1834, poet Letitia Landon wrote The Dream of the Wanderer, inspired by Virginia Dare. In the early 1900s, outdoor dramas like The Lost Colony by Paul Green turned the story into living theater, performed under the stars of Roanoke Island every summer. Presidents and schoolchildren alike watched the play, hearing the same haunting refrain, "Where did they go?" Even today, the name Roanoke evokes both wonder and unease, a reminder that the American story began with uncertainty. Modern archaeology has not given up. Teams of scientists, historians, and volunteers still dig in the soil of the Outer Banks and the mainland coast, using drone mapping, laser scanning, and ground-penetrating radar. They uncover shards of pottery, nails, and traces of wooden structures. Each fragment tells part of a forgotten story. At Site X, a location near the Albemarle Sound, archaeologists discovered artifacts that matched the style and materials of 16th-century English life. A border pipe stem, a piece of slate pencil, a nail of a design unique to Elizabethan carpentry. Some experts believe this may be where a group of Roanoke survivors resettled, deep inland for safety. At Hatteras Island, others have found relics of both English and native origin side by side, European tools, arrowheads, glass beads. A shared life, perhaps. And so, each generation inches closer to the truth, while the legend keeps breathing. Maybe that's the real beauty of Roanoke, it refuses to give us closure. It keeps asking us to look deeper, into the past, and into ourselves. Picture John White, the artist-governor, in his old age. He sits by candlelight in England, sketching the memories of a place he can never return to, the forests, the rivers, the faces of the people he met. His journal entries fade into sadness. He writes of his beloved Virginia, of the granddaughter he never saw again. For him, the New World was both heaven and heartbreak. He had seen its promise and felt its loss. Yet through his maps, his paintings, and his words, he gave England its first real image of America, a land alive with color and mystery. Even if his colony disappeared, his art survived. His watercolors of native life, plants, and animals remain among the most detailed records of early America ever made. In a way, John White succeeded where his colony failed, he preserved the first meeting of worlds in ink and pigment, so that history would never forget. Today, when we speak of the lost colony, we are really speaking of beginnings. The beginning of English America. The beginning of cross-cultural contact. The beginning of myth-making in the New World. Roanoke stands as both triumph and tragedy, the moment when Europe first tried to root itself in American soil, and the wilderness pushed back. It reminds us that progress often rises from failure. Without Roanoke, there might never have been Jamestown, Plymouth, or the United States that grew from them. But it also warns us of arrogance, of coming to a new land without understanding it. The English thought they were planting civilization, instead, they found themselves dependent on the very people they had underestimated. In that way, Roanoke is not just history, it is prophecy. Every generation that ventures into the unknown, whether across oceans or into space, faces the same truth: discovery without humility leads to loss. Stand, for a moment, on the edge of Roanoke Island at dusk. The sun sets over the Albemarle Sound, painting the water gold and crimson. The pine trees whisper in the wind. Somewhere beneath your feet lies the soil where men and women once dared to dream, where they built homes, raised children, and called this wilderness home. They may have vanished, but their courage remains. Because every colony, every settlement, every town that followed carried a little piece of their hope. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is not a story about disappearance. It's a story about persistence. It's about the human need to begin again, even when the odds are impossible. And perhaps that's why the mystery endures, because deep down, we see ourselves in it. We are all searching for a place to belong, a place to build, a place to start over. Maybe that's what Virginia Dare represents, not a lost child, but the first heartbeat of a new world. 400 years later, the waves still wash over the sand, erasing footprints but never memory. And every time someone whispers the word Roanoke, that memory rises again, like a ghost from the sea, calling us to remember where the American story truly began. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.